A police officer thought it was just another walk with his little girl, until they found a starving German shepherd on the street corner sold for only $3. What started as an act of kindness uncovered a hidden world of cruelty, betrayal, and redemption. This battered dog wasn't just a stray. He carried secrets that would pull father and daughter into a dangerous fight against an organized crime ring. Will they survive what follows? Watch till the end, and if this story moves, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. A July sun sagged low over Willow Creek, Montana, warming the brickwork and the faded bunting that still clung to the light poles from the town's 4th of July parade. On Main Street, the diner's neon coffee cup hummed and a flag on the post office luffed once, then fell quiet. Officer Michael Harris, dark blue polo badge on a leather belt he wore even on his day off, walked beside his daughter Emily. They had split a slice of peach pie at Mabel's, shared a root beer, and were taking the long way back to the car because neither of them wanted to rush a Saturday that felt for once unburdened. Emily's hand was small and warm in his. She was 10, going on fearless ponytail, skewed by a morning of backyard basketball, scuffed white sneakers keeping easy rhythm on the sidewalk. She talked about the library's summer reading prize and whether their tomato plant would survive the heat wave. Michael nodded, half listening, half lost in the sweetness of ordinary time. How rare it was, how quietly it threaded through a life that had seen too many sirens. They were passing the thrift store when he saw the sign. A piece of cardboard edges fuzzed black marker scrawled, $3, take him today. The man holding it leaned against a lamppost and the thin shade shoulders caved in like a house after a fire. He wore a sun-bleached ball cap, a denim shirt gone gray at the collar, and boots that had quit on him months ago. His beard looked as if it had been cut with a pocket knife. He kept his eyes moving, never letting them rest. On the sidewalk by his feet lay a German shepherd. Even from a distance, Michael registered details, the way training made him coat dulled and patchy. Along the flanks, ribs suggested in the shallow of each breath, one ear tipped over at the top where cartilage had once given way. There was a tight mark circling the dog's neck, not raw but unmistakable, a groove where something had been too tight for too long. The dog watched them without lifting his head, eyes dark and steady, the kind that have learned how to wait. Emily's voice thinned to a whisper. "Dad." Michael slowed. He felt the old guard inside him rise, the part that cataloged risks, calculated outcomes, tried to place a lid on a child's mercy because the world didn't always make room for it. "Let's keep moving," he said softly. "We don't know this animal." The man raised the cardboard as if to block the sun. $10, he said, the words dry from disuse. "Food costs more than I got. He needs a home." Michael met the man's gaze. There was a flicker there, not shame exactly, not menace, but something like a door that had been shut hard and now only opened a crack. "What's his name?" Emily asked. Michael wished she hadn't. The man looked down as if the question had found a bruise. "Different people called him different things," he said. "I just call him Boy." The dog shifted a careful slide that spared his back right leg. Tendon or bone? Michael couldn't tell from a glance, but it wasn't nothing. Emily knelt without asking permission. He started to object and then watched her move slow hand out, palm down. The shepherd's nostrils quivered. He took in her scent with a patience that felt human. His tail didn't wag, just a single thump, restrained as if joy were something he hadn't had permission to show in a long while. "He's gentle," she said, pronouncing it like a fact she'd measured. Michael crouched. Up close, the dog smelled of sun-warmed fur and a tang of old iron, the metallic ghost of dried blood caught in hair you couldn't wash clean without time. Flecks of gray salted his muzzle. That neck groove was deeper than he'd feared. He reached out a knuckle. The dog blinked once, accepting. "How long you had him?" Michael asked the man, while the man said, "Long enough to know I can't keep him." "Where'd you get him?" The man's eyes skittered past Michael toward the crosswalk, then farther to the alley beside the hardware store to the parking lot behind the feed store mapping exits without moving. Someone owed me. Paid me with a mouth to feed. He tried to laugh. It cracked and died. Michael felt the familiar tension in his chest, the coil that forms when a story arrives with too many doors and not enough windows. A patrol car idled 2 blocks down outside the bakery. He could call Rodriguez over, make this official, but the dog's eyes held him in place, and the weight of his daughter's hope kept him from turning this into a scene. 10, the man said again. Cash. Dad, Emily said barely above the hum of traffic. Please. Michael had made a lifetime of saying no. It had saved him. It had cost him. He studied the shepherd's posture, ears forward without challenge, gaze fixed but not hard, mouth closed, weight forward just enough to rise if needed. A trained dog learns how to be still. He thought of the week's calls, noise complaints, a neighbor dispute, a fender bender, and of the unslept parts of his year that had names: a missing girl who was found too late, a burglary string with no prints, a case file heavy with photographs that didn't testify. He took out his wallet. The man's hand shook when he saw the bills, not with gratitude, but with nerves. Fear, Michael realized. Fear of staying in one place too long. He passed over a 10 and a 5 because 10 felt like an insult to something that had once been valuable. The man didn't count. He folded the bills into his hat, jammed it on his head, and bobbed a thanks without looking at either of them. What's your name? Michael asked, not unkind. The man hesitated. Ray, he said, and then Collins, as if the last name were a door closed after the first. Hold up, Ray, do you have vet records? Any paperwork? But Ray was already moving loose and quick, slipping between a couple heading toward the ice cream shop and a kid on a scooter. He crossed mid-block, ducked into the alley by the hardware store, and didn't look back. By the time Michael reached the mouth of the alley, Ray was gone. A pickup backfired somewhere near the feed store. A gull laughed over the river. The rest of town proceeded as if nothing had just changed. Emily had her arms around the shepherd's neck, but not tight. The dog accepted it, breath slow, and measured one ear tipped toward the alley as if listening for a name that wouldn't be called. We can't just bring him home, Michael said, because he had to say the thing responsible fathers say. We don't know if he's chipped, if he belongs to someone, and we need a vet to look at that leg. We can do all that, Emily said quickly. We can do it right. Michael considered the weight of promises. He took the frayed length of rope lying beside the dog, a leash in intent, not in kindness, and looped it lightly. The shepherd stood, tested his footing, favored the back leg, but did not complain. Michael felt a tremor under his palm that wasn't fear so much as fatigue. Let's get you some water, he murmured. They walked the short block to the diner again. Mabel, who had watched Michael grow from a high school shortstop into the kind of cop who drank coffee without sugar, brought out a stainless bowl and filled it from the tea pitcher. He yours? She asked, eyes softening before he answered. We're trying that out, Michael said. The shepherd lowered his head and drank steady and controlled as if he'd learned long ago that water wasn't guaranteed. Emily held the bowl with both hands, careful not to crowd him. When the dog finished, he sat unbidden beside her left knee. The position tugged something at the back of Michael's mind, not a memory, but a recognition of a pattern left side heel weight. He glanced at the groove around the neck again. He'd seen marks like that on dogs who wore pinch collars too long on animals kept for work instead of life. He does that on his own, Michael said half to himself. Emily looked up, gray eyes catching a sliver of late light. What does it mean? It means someone taught him to be good, Michael said, and heard in his own voice a tenderness he hadn't planned to share out loud. He squatted level with the shepherd and spoke the word quietly, an old standard from training he'd watched on the range a dozen times. Sit. The dog was already sitting. Michael tried another equally soft. Down. The shepherd hesitated, then eased to his elbows, careful with the back leg. He didn't break eye contact. Emily smiled like sunrise. "Can we name him?" she asked. Michael hesitated. Names were commitments. Names meant the thing was yours, even if you told yourself it wasn't. "Let's get him checked first," he said, and stood. The shepherd rose too, shadowing his left knee rope slack between them. As they stepped into the crosswalk, the last of the day's heat came off the pavement in a breath. Somewhere downriver, a train horn blew long and low, 2 notes stretched across town. Michael felt the sound settle in his bones. He glanced once more toward the alley as if Ray Collins might materialize. He didn't. Some stories exit before you can get a plate. On the other side of the street, Emily reached for the shepherd's ear and smoothed the bent tip with her thumb. The dog leaned a fraction into her touch, a motion so slight it might have been a trick of light. Michael caught it anyway. "You're safe," Emily whispered, as if safety were a thing you could speak into existence if you meant it enough. The shepherd didn't understand the word, but he understood tone, and tone is a kind of shelter. Michael opened the back door of his sedan. The shepherd looked at the seat at Michael, at Emily. He lifted one paw, placed it, gathered himself, and climbed in, tucking the sore leg carefully. Emily slid in beside him and clicked her seatbelt palm resting on the dog's shoulder. Michael closed the door gently, as if not to wake something. As he rounded the hood, he saw their reflections in the glass. The man who knew how to say no, the girl who knew how to ask anyway, and the dog who watched both of them with an attention that felt like a test and a gift. He started the car. The engine turned over. Heat shimmered on the road ahead like a curtain that might lift if you were brave enough to drive through it. "We'll stop by the clinic," he said. "Then the station. We'll do this right." Emily nodded, eyes forward, hope sitting upright in her chest. The shepherd lay down, head on her sneakers, breathing steady, as if he had been waiting for a sentence that had finally been spoken. Michael checked his mirrors, signaled, and pulled into the slow river of Main Street traffic. He didn't see Ray again. He didn't expect to. But he felt the shape of what had started a small decision, with a long shadow, and for the first time in a long time, the shadow didn't scare him. It felt like a road. The veterinary clinic stood at the edge of Willow Creek, a squat brick building with a peeling green awning and the smell of disinfectant mixed with hay drifting from the adjacent feed store. Michael parked in the gravel lot and glanced into the back seat where Emily sat with the German shepherd's head resting across her lap. The dog's eyes stayed half closed but never fully surrendered to rest, and his body remained taut as if ready to spring if commanded. Emily stroked the bent ear, whispering words only a child would think to speak, promises that sounded soft and absolute. Inside the waiting room buzzed with the low murmur of farmers bringing in cats with burrs in their fur, a boy holding a rabbit with drooping ears, and a couple with a terrier wrapped in a towel. When Michael guided the shepherd through the door, every head turned. The dog walked close at his left knee posture, disciplined despite the limp eyes scanning each corner as if measuring distances and memorizing exits. Michael recognized it instantly trained behavior. He had worked beside K9 units often enough to know the difference between a dog that obeyed and a dog that understood. The vet, Dr. Jensen, came out from the back wiping his hands on a paper towel. He was in his late 50s. Hair thinning shoulders, stooped from years of leaning over tables, but his eyes were sharp. "What do we have here?" he asked, and Michael explained quickly how they had come across the dog. Dr. Jensen listened without interrupting, then crouched slowly. He extended a hand, palm down, the way professionals did. The shepherd did not shy away. Instead, he sniffed once, then settled back, gaze unwavering. When Jensen lifted the fur around the neck, his expression hardened. There, beneath the matted hair, a deep groove circled like a scarred necklace, skin thickened and hairless. "That's from prolonged use of a prong or chain collar," he said quietly. "Not just a few weeks. Years." He pointed to the leg. Old fracture healed badly. He compensates, but he'll always favor it." Emily's face paled, her small hand tightening on the dog's shoulder. "Can you help him?" she asked. Jensen nodded. "He'll need rest, good food, clean water, and patience. Nothing he hasn't already proved he deserves." While the vet checked vitals and drew blood for tests, Michael stood by watching the shepherd's stillness. No growl, no flinch, just an almost military patience. Jensen looked up once. "You know he's been trained, not a house pet. Commands discipline posture, it's all there." Michael kept his voice even. "K9. Jensen shrugged. "Could be police, could be private. Hard to say. But someone invested time in him." They returned home that evening with antibiotics, a bag of prescription food, and a file marked simply Shepherd Male Est. 7 to 8 years. Emily carried the receipt like it was adoption papers. At the house, she spread a blanket on the porch and placed a bowl of water and food beside it. The shepherd approached with cautious steps, lowered himself carefully, and drank again in measured pulls. The porch light flickered on as dusk came. Michael sat in the old rocking chair, coffee cooling in his hand, and watched Emily lean against the shepherd's side, sketchbook open on her knees. She was drawing him bent, ear-scarred neck eyes like deep wells. Every so often she stopped to scratch his chest, and the dog would thump his tail, once an acknowledgement more than a gesture of joy. At one point, a neighbor's truck backfired down the road. The shepherd was on his feet in an instant, body low, ears forward, eyes fixed on the sound. Emily startled, but Michael noticed the dog did not bark wildly. Instead, he stood between her and the street posture controlled, waiting for instruction that never came. Michael's breath caught. This was no ordinary response. It was protection, trained and deliberate. Later, after Emily had gone to bed, Michael sat on the porch with the shepherd lying nearby, his silhouette etched by the glow of the kitchen window. He spoke softly, half to himself. "Who trained you, and why'd they let you go?" The shepherd turned his head slightly, as if considering an answer only he could give, then lowered his chin onto his paws. The night was still except for crickets, and Michael felt the weight of possibility pressing in. Over the next few days, routines formed. Emily woke early to feed him, whispering his new name Ranger, which seemed to fit as naturally as if it had always belonged. Ranger followed commands without hesitation. Sit, stay, heel. Michael tried each once, not intending to test, but compelled by habit, and the responses came precise and swift. The scars around the neck were less red now, though still raw to look at. Emily brushed his coat, gently collecting clumps of dead fur, and he tolerated it with the patience of one who understood grooming as duty, not luxury. One afternoon, while Michael repaired a loose shutter, a delivery truck rumbled up the lane. Ranger moved instantly, trotting to the edge of the yard, planting himself between Emily and the vehicle. He did not bark until the driver stepped out, then let loose a single low warning sound that froze the man mid-step. Michael hurried over, thanked the driver, and called Ranger back. The shepherd returned at once, eyes still fixed on the stranger until the truck rolled away. Emily clapped softly. "He protected me, Dad?" Michael put a hand on the dog's head, feeling the strength beneath the scars. "Yes," he said. "He did." That night, Michael lay awake, listening to Ranger's slow breathing from the rug in Emily's room. He thought of Ray Collins vanishing into the alley, of the scarred groove around Ranger's neck, of the disciplined way he guarded, waited, obeyed. Too much added up. Too much refused to let go. He turned onto his side, staring into the dark, and understood that bringing Ranger home was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something larger. Something that had already brushed against his past and was circling back again. The first sign came quietly. Michael sat at the kitchen table late on a Wednesday night, paperwork from the department spread before him, the muted hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, when Ranger rose from the rug without warning. The shepherd padded toward the front window, posture, stiff ears, forward muscles quivering under the scars that still marked his neck. Michael followed his gaze and caught the briefest shimmer of movement beyond the hedge too low for a deer, too purposeful for wind. By the time he reached the porch with a flashlight, the gravel at the edge of the yard was settling as if someone had just moved through. He swept the beam across the driveway, but the night swallowed detail. Ranger stayed at his side, body angled between Michael and the dark eyes, sharp tail still. Michael's hand brushed the butt of his service weapon out of habit, but he didn't draw. The air smelled faintly of oil, as if a car had idled too long nearby. He walked the perimeter, found nothing, and returned inside unsettled. The next morning, Emily mentioned she had heard footsteps outside her window. Michael told her it had probably been a raccoon, but the look Ranger gave him said otherwise. Over the next few nights, the signs multiplied. Ranger stiffening near the back door at 2 a.m, tire tracks pressed into the shoulder of the gravel road, where no neighbor had reason to stop the faint reflection of glass across the way, as if binoculars had caught a porch light. Michael's instincts, honed by years of patrol, told him this was no coincidence. Someone was watching the house. Still, he didn't want to alarm Emily, so he reinforced the locks, double-checked the windows, and kept Ranger close. On Friday evening, when the sun slid behind the cottonwoods and cicadas whirred like restless wires, Emily ran out to the mailbox at the end of the drive. She came back slower than usual, envelope in hand, her expression uneasy. "Dad," she said, voice small. This was in there. The envelope bore no stamp, no address, only his name in block letters across the front. Michael felt his throat tighten as he slid it open. Inside lay a single piece of paper folded once. In thick black marker were the words, "Return the dog if you want to stay safe." There was no signature, no flourish, just a blunt directive. Emily's eyes widened and she looked instinctively at Ranger, who stood close, sensing tension. Michael folded the note back into the envelope, his jaw tight. He took Emily's shoulders gently. "Don't worry," he said. "It's just someone trying to scare us." She nodded, but her grip on Ranger's fur said she understood more than he wished. That night, Michael placed the envelope on his desk and stared at it long after Emily had gone to bed. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and grease, a working man's scent. The handwriting was rough letters, pressed hard as if anger had been driven into each stroke. He replayed Ray Collins' face in his mind, the nervous eyes, the hurried exit, but Ray hadn't struck him as bold enough to leave threats. This was someone else, someone who knew what Ranger was worth. Ranger slept lightly, ears twitching at every creak of the house. Twice he rose and padded to the hallway, growling low at the closed front door. Michael kept the porch light on until dawn, a habit he hadn't practiced since his early years on the force when threats carried into his home life. The next day, he brought Ranger with him to the station under the guise of a checkup with the department's K-9 officer. He showed the anonymous note to Carla Reeves, the only colleague he trusted, without hesitation. Carla frowned as she read it. "Somebody knows exactly what this dog is," she said. "This isn't random." She leaned closer to Ranger, studied his posture, and whispered, "He heals like a soldier." Michael nodded. "And whoever wants him back isn't going to stop with one note." Carla urged him to file an official report, but Michael hesitated, worried it would draw more attention than protection. For now, he tucked the envelope back into his jacket pocket and returned home. That evening, Emily set up her homework at the kitchen table while Ranger lay under the window. A car slowed at the end of the drive, headlights lingering. Ranger rose growl deep in his chest, body angled toward the road. Michael stepped outside, badge clipped to his belt, flashlight in hand, but the car accelerated away before he reached the gate. Its taillights vanished into the trees. He stood in the quiet night, the air thick with pine and the faint echo of retreating tires, and he knew with certainty that someone was circling them, measuring, waiting. Inside, Emily asked if everything was fine. Michael forced a smile. Just someone lost. But the unease in his chest told him otherwise. When he tucked her into bed, Ranger curled on the rug by her feet without needing instruction. Michael lingered in the doorway, watching the silhouette of the shepherd steady and alert. He whispered so softly only the dog could hear. "Keep her safe." Ranger lifted his head ears forward, and then settled again as if acknowledging the order. Later, at his desk, Michael spread the envelope and note, again tracing the heavy letters with his finger. Whoever wrote them knew Ranger's value and was willing to trespass into his life to reclaim it. The scar around the shepherd's neck seemed to pulse in memory, a reminder that this was no ordinary stray, but a piece of something larger, darker, still alive out there. Michael exhaled slowly and shut off the desk lamp. He knew the next step was no longer optional. He would have to follow Ranger's past wherever it led. The night after the note arrived, Michael found it impossible to rest his mind replaying the heavy strokes of those words and the shadows that had brushed against the edges of his home. Ranger lay in the hallway, ears twitching with every distant sound, and when the clock neared midnight, the shepherd rose suddenly and padded toward the back door. Michael followed with his jacket in hand, and when he opened the door, Ranger slipped into the darkness, moving with the kind of intent that made it clear he was not wandering, but leading. The air outside smelled of wet grass and old wood, and the road shimmered under a thin veil of mist. Michael stayed close, flashlight low, as Ranger crossed the yard and veered into the tree line. Each step the dog took was measured, his nose to the ground, tail stiff body pulling forward with a sense of purpose that felt almost human. They moved along a narrow deer trail, branches snapping underfoot until they reached the edge of the industrial district, a part of town most families had no reason to visit. Ranger stopped before a chain-link fence sagging with rust. Beyond it loomed a warehouse with broken windows and a roofline jagged against the moonlight. Michael felt the chill of recognition. He had been here once years ago on a call that had ended with nothing more than a report of trespassing. It had been marked as abandoned, a relic of Willow Creek's logging days, but now standing here with Ranger pressed to the fence, he knew it had never truly been empty. Ranger nosed at a gap where the wire had bent low. Michael ducked through boots scraping concrete and swept his beam across the interior through the half-open door. The light fell on rows of metal cages stacked like filing cabinets. Some hung open and empty, their doors swinging with the draft, but others still held the imprint of animals, long-gone tufts of fur claw marks, scratched deep into steel, the faint, sour stench of neglect that even years could not erase. Ranger growled low, nose pressed to one of the cages, body trembling. Michael's chest tightened. He crouched, running a hand across the cold bars, and found initials carved faintly into the metal, not by machine, but by hand, J.D. His pulse quickened because he remembered those letters. 3 years ago, he had worked a case involving missing dogs from neighboring towns. There had been rumors of an organized ring selling them across state lines, but evidence had been scarce, witnesses too frightened, and the trail had gone cold. The one name that surfaced repeatedly was a man called Joe Dalton, though nothing had ever been pinned to him. Seeing those initials now scratched into steel inside this warehouse pulled that dormant file back into brutal clarity. Michael photographed the cages with his phone, his hands steady even as his heart raced. Ranger moved ahead, leading him to a desk half collapsed against the wall. Papers littered the floor, damp and curling at the edges. Michael sifted through them carefully and uncovered a ledger. The columns listed breeds' weights and dollar amounts, each line item marked with a date. His stomach turned as he realized it was an inventory, each living creature reduced to figures and transactions. One entry caught his eye: GS-17 retired, damaged, not suitable release. He didn't need anyone to tell him what GS stood for. German Shepherd. Ranger pressed his nose to the page as if confirming what Michael already knew. This was no coincidence. This dog had been part of that ledger, a number crossed out, discarded because injury had stolen his monetary worth. Michael's flashlight beam swept farther and landed on something that made his breath falter: an old nylon collar, half buried under dust stamped faintly with the insignia of a regional K-9 training program that had been shuttered years ago. He picked it up, the cracked plastic buckle crumbling under his fingers. Ranger whined softly at the sight of it, then looked at Michael with eyes that seemed to carry both memory and plea. Michael pocketed the collar. His training told him to call it in to wait for backup, but instinct told him the place was already vacated by anyone who mattered, left behind like a stage after the actors had gone. What mattered now was connecting the ledger, the cages, and the initials to the file buried in the department's archives. As he turned to leave, Ranger stiffened again, ears pricked toward the far side of the warehouse. Michael froze and listened. For a long moment, there was only the whisper of wind through broken panes. Then faintly the sound of a door shutting somewhere deeper in the building. He swept his light, but the shadows swallowed detail. Whoever had been here was gone now, slipping out the back as quietly as Ray Collins had days earlier. Michael's jaw clenched. They knew he had found the trail, and now they would move faster, cover, deeper, hide better. He and Ranger returned home in silence, the dog padding close at his heel. The porch light spilled across the yard like a beacon, and through the window, he saw Emily asleep on the couch with her sketchbook on her chest. Drawings of Ranger spread like fallen leaves. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her breathe, feeling the weight of what he had just uncovered pressing down heavier than the badge on his belt. Upstairs, he placed the ledger and collar on his desk beside the anonymous note. The pieces of the puzzle lay side by side, the scar around Ranger's neck. The abandoned warehouse filled with cages, the initials J.D., the ledger marking release. He realized with a sinking certainty that the case he had once left unfinished had returned to his doorstep through the battered body of a German shepherd who refused to be broken. Michael exhaled and rubbed his temples, already planning his next move. He would have to dig into the old file, reopen what the department had closed, and trace the shadows that had resurfaced in Willow Creek. The enemy was not just watching now. The enemy was moving. Michael sat at his desk the next morning with the ledger open before him, its brittle pages reeking faintly of mildew and regret, and after a long hour of debating, he carried it into the station. The precinct buzzed with the usual chatter of routine calls, officers pouring coffee and joking about traffic stops, but Michael felt as though he carried a weight heavier than paperwork. He went straight to Captain Reynolds, a man with thinning hair and a belly pressed against his belt, who had once mentored Michael when he was fresh on the force. He laid the ledger, the anonymous note, and the collar on Reynolds's desk and explained everything he and Ranger had discovered. The captain listened, his expression unmoving, and when Michael finished speaking, the room seemed too still. Reynolds leaned back, tapped the ledger once with his finger, and said quietly, "Michael, I suggest you let this one go." Michael blinked, stunned. "Sir, these are records of trafficking cruelty, maybe across state lines. This ties back to Dalton." Reynolds' eyes sharpened briefly, then softened with something like weariness. "You don't have enough to hold up in court. And Dalton has friends in places we can't reach. Pursuing this will only stir trouble and put your family in the line of fire. Sometimes the best service you can give your town is knowing when to close a drawer." Michael's jaw tightened. He pressed asking for at least surveillance support, but Reynolds shook his head. "Not this time. My advice is to care for that dog, lock your doors, and move on." Michael gathered the evidence slowly, heart heavy, and walked out of the office with the hollow realization that his captain's caution was not born of ignorance, but of fear or worse, complicity. At home, Emily noticed his silence. She asked if the captain was going to help, and Michael forced a small smile. "We'll handle it," he said, though inside he knew he was standing more alone than ever. That weekend, Emily grew restless. She had overheard more than Michael realized, and the thought that Ranger had once been caged gnawed at her. On Sunday afternoon, she asked to ride her bike into town. Michael agreed, thinking the distance short and the sun still high, but Ranger paced by the door as if protesting. Emily pedaled down the road, her braid bouncing, and as she reached the outskirts near the grain silos, she heard a sound, faint and desperate. She stopped listening and then followed it under the bridge by the creek. There, in the shadows, she found a cardboard box damp from spray, and inside curled a puppy no older than 4 months. Its fur was mottled brown, its ribs sharp, one eye swollen shut. Emily's heart clenched. She knelt, whispered softly, and reached into the box. The puppy trembled but did not bite, simply pressed against her chest when she lifted it. She wrapped it in her jacket and pedaled home as fast as she could. When she burst into the kitchen, Michael was startled by the urgency in her voice. "Dad, look what I found," she said, setting the small bundle on a towel. Ranger approached, sniffed carefully, and then settled beside the puppy as if recognizing its pain. Michael examined the animal, saw the bruising, the neglect, and felt both fury and dread. He knew instantly this was no random stray. Someone had left it discarded just as Ranger had been, and by bringing it home, Emily had painted another target on their door. "Emily," he said firmly, though his tone was gentle, "you should have told me first." Her eyes welled. "I couldn't leave him. He would have died." Michael could not argue. He sighed, fetched warm water, and together they cleaned the puppy's wounds. Emily named him Scout, declaring he looked brave despite his size. Ranger lay nearby, occasionally nudging Scout with his nose, a silent guardian. That night, as the 2 dogs slept, Michael sat at the table turning the captain's words in his mind. "Let it go," Reynolds had said. But here was living proof that the cruelty had not stopped. The ring was still operating, still discarding lives when convenient, still spreading fear into his town. And now his daughter, with her boundless compassion, had unknowingly tied them deeper into the fight. Outside, a car slowed at the edge of the driveway again. Michael killed the kitchen light and stood at the window watching the silhouette idle too long before disappearing into the night. His chest tightened. They were being watched more closely now, and the addition of Scout meant the hunters knew exactly where to aim. He looked at Ranger sleeping lightly beside the puppy and whispered to himself, "They're not taking you back. Any of you." As dawn crept in, he knew what had to come next. The department would not help. The ring would not stop. It would fall on him to gather proof to follow Ranger's lead and to protect Emily at all costs. The days that followed Scout's arrival carried a tension Michael could feel in the air like a storm that refused to break. He drove Emily to school in the mornings, his eyes scanning every passing vehicle, his hand never far from the wheel, as if preparing to turn back at the first sign of trouble. At home, Ranger stayed near Emily, shadowing her as she played in the yard while Scout remained too weak to leave the porch for long. The anonymous watchers had grown bolder. Twice Michael found cigarette butts near the gate fresh in the gravel where no neighbor would have stood, and one morning he discovered a muddy footprint on the back steps. He tightened security, replaced locks, and kept his sidearm within reach even off duty, but unease clung to him because the enemy knew his daughter's face and patience was their weapon. One evening near twilight, Emily sat drawing on the porch with both dogs at her side when the phone rang inside. Michael answered, expecting a routine call, but the voice on the other end was low and deliberate. "You have something that belongs to us. 2 things now. Return them, or the little girl pays the price." The line went dead before Michael could respond. His hand trembled slightly as he set the receiver down. He stepped back onto the porch and studied Emily, her small frame bent over her sketchbook, blissfully unaware of the words that had just pierced his world. He forced calm into his voice. "Emily, let's go inside for dinner." She looked up puzzled but obeyed, ushering Ranger and Scout in with her. That night, Michael did not sleep. He sat by the window rifle across his lap, Ranger lying beside him, tense and watchful. Around 2 a.m, headlights flickered at the end of the drive, then extinguished. Moments later, gravel crunched underfoot outside the gate. Ranger growled deep in his chest, lips curling, body pressing against the door as if ready to break it down. Michael whispered, "Stay." And the shepherd froze but did not relax. Shadows shifted near the mailbox, and then a voice called softly through the dark, chilling in its calmness. Pretty little girl you have, Officer Harris. She won't be safe forever. Michael threw the door open, flashlight beam slicing the yard, and shouted a warning. Ranger surged past him, charging toward the voice teeth, bared a guardian unchained. He heard footsteps retreating quick and purposeful, and then a metallic flash as a figure swung a pipe at the shepherd. The sound of impact cracked through the night. Ranger yelped but did not fall. Instead, he lunged again, forcing the attacker back into the ditch. Michael ran forward, weapon drawn, but another figure emerged from the trees, and the two men scrambled into a waiting truck. Tires spun gravel into the air as they roared away, leaving silence broken only by Ranger's labored breathing. Michael dropped to his knees beside the dog. Blood darkened Ranger's shoulder, matting his coat where the pipe had struck. Emily appeared in the doorway, wide-eyed Scout barking shrill and panicked. Michael barked an order for her to stay inside, then pressed his hands against the wound. "Easy, boy. Stay with me." Ranger's eyes, though clouded with pain, remained locked on his handler, refusing to close. Michael carried him inside, with Emily trailing, close tears streaming. On the kitchen floor, he worked quickly, cleaning the wound, wrapping it tight, whispering words of reassurance that steadied Emily as much as they steadied the dog. Through the long night, Ranger drifted in and out of consciousness, groaning softly, and Michael sat beside him, refusing to leave. Emily curled against Scout in the corner, her face pale but resolute. At dawn, Michael made a decision. He had tried to balance caution with duty, but the attack shattered any illusion of safety. The enemy had crossed his line and threatened his child. This was no longer about evidence or bureaucracy. This was personal, and it was war. By mid-morning, Ranger stirred, trying to rise despite the bandages. Michael laid a hand gently on his head. "Rest. You've done enough for now." The shepherd thumped his tail weakly in response, a gesture of loyalty unbroken by pain. Emily knelt beside them, stroking Ranger's muzzle. "He saved me, Dad," she whispered. Michael swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, sweetheart. And now it's our turn to save him, and to stop the people who did this." That afternoon, he returned to the warehouse alone, searching for anything he might have missed while Emily remained home with Scout and a trusted neighbor watching over them. In the dust, he found fresh tire tracks, proof that the place had been visited again since his first discovery. The fight was escalating, and now he had no choice but to step deeper into the shadows that Ranger had uncovered. As Michael drove back, the weight of resolve settled on him like armor. They had threatened his daughter and injured the dog that had saved her. That made the case no longer about paperwork or approval. It had become a battle he would carry alone if he had to, a battle that would end only when the men who lurked in the dark were dragged into the light. Michael spent the following days in quiet preparation, each hour thick with the knowledge that the people who had struck Ranger and threatened Emily would not stop. Ranger was recovering slowly, the bandages tight around his shoulder. His movements careful, but his spirit had not dimmed. Every time the truck passed down the road or a branch cracked outside, the shepherd lifted his head ears, tilting toward danger. Emily never left his side, whispering promises into his fur, as though words could mend wounds. Michael knew he could no longer wait. He needed allies who would not look away. He drove across town and knocked on the door of Carla Reeves, a deputy he trusted from years of patrol. Carla was sharp-eyed and unyielding, a woman who carried herself with quiet strength. After hearing everything, the warehouse, the ledger, the threats, she leaned back in her chair, her jaw tight. "If Reynolds won't back you, I will," she said. "But you'll need more than me." Michael nodded and reached out to Jordan Price, a tall officer known for his steady calm. Jordan listened without a word, then clasped Michael's hand firmly. "I'm with you. Just tell me where." Together, they planned a covert operation to raid the compound Michael believed still housed the ring's dogs. They agreed to move at night under cover of silence, armed not with a full squad, but with trust in each other. Michael felt the weight of risk, yet for the first time since the threat began, he felt less alone. On the night of the raid, rain slicked the trees and muted their footsteps. Ranger insisted on coming limping, but determined, his eyes burning with purpose. Emily begged to go too, her voice trembling, but Michael ordered her to stay behind. Still, as the convoy of 2 trucks left the driveway, he caught a glimpse of her shadow near the barn, watching her arms folded tight around Scout. His heart clenched with worry, but he forced focus on the mission. They reached the compound near the old quarry. The tarps fluttered in the wind. Lanterns glowed faintly inside, and the faint whimper of dogs carried through the night. Michael signaled, and Carla flanked right while Jordan circled left. Ranger led forward, nose to the ground, every muscle taut. They breached the fence, quietly, bolt cutters slicing through chain, and moved toward the cages. The smell of neglect hit them instantly sharp with urine and damp straw. As Michael and Carla began unlocking kennels, freeing weak dogs, one by one, Jordan lingered at the gate. Michael caught the hesitation in his posture, the way his hand hovered near his radio, and a dread suspicion grew. Moments later, headlights swept across the compound from the far ridge, and men poured out of the shadows armed with pipes and clubs. Michael turned toward Jordan just in time to see him lower his radio gilt flashing in his eyes. "I had no choice," he muttered, but his words were drowned out by the clash that followed. Chaos erupted. Carla fought fiercely, swinging her baton with precision while Michael held his ground near the cages, protecting the frightened animals. Ranger lunged, despite his injury, his growl thunderous, forcing one attacker back into the mud. The men shouted, surrounding them, but Michael's resolve hardened. This was no longer about duty, it was about survival. Amid the frenzy, Michael heard a voice that froze him in place, Emily's. He spun to see her slip through the broken fence, drenched in rain, her eyes wide with determination. "Dad, that one's hurt," she cried, pointing to a cage near the back where a whimpering Labrador lay bleeding. Before Michael could stop her, she dashed forward, weaving between cages, her small figure illuminated by the beam of a lantern. He shouted for her to return, but the storm of battle drowned his words. Emily reached the cage, pulled at the rusted latch with trembling hands, and freed the wounded dog. She cradled it against her, whispering reassurance, even as men closed in. One of the attackers raised a pipe toward her, but Ranger threw himself forward with a ferocity born of loyalty, slamming into the man's legs and dragging him down. The shepherd's wound reopened, blood mixing with rain, but he did not falter. Michael rushed to Emily's side, his heart pounding. His vision narrowed to the sight of his daughter holding the injured dog. Ranger standing guard and enemies pressing closer. Carla forced 2 men back with swift strikes, her voice cutting through the storm. "We need to move now." Michael gathered Emily and the Labrador, pushing them toward the exit. Ranger limped after them, teeth bared, his body trembling but unyielding. Betrayal still stung. Jordan had vanished into the dark, leaving them outnumbered, but Michael's focus was clear. He fired a warning shot into the air, the sound cracking like thunder, buying precious seconds as the attackers stumbled. Together they fought their way out, dragging cages open as they went, unleashing terrified dogs that scattered into the night. By the time they reached the trucks, Michael's chest burned with exhaustion and fury. Emily clutched the Labrador, soaked and shaking but alive. Ranger collapsed briefly at her feet, chest heaving, then forced himself upright once more, unwilling to surrender while she needed him. As Michael started the engine and drove them away, the compound lights faded behind them, but the memory of betrayal and the sight of Ranger bleeding etched deep into his mind. The ring had shown its face, Jordan had revealed his treachery, and Emily's courage had nearly cost her everything. Michael gripped the wheel harder, rain lashing against the windshield, his eyes hard. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a war for survival, a fight for family, and a battle that demanded nothing less than absolute resolve. The night of the raid left Michael restless, his thoughts clouded with betrayal. The memory of Jordan's face, disappearing into the shadows, burned behind his eyes. Emily slept fitfully beside the rescued Labrador Scout curled at her feet, while Ranger lay on the rug breathing heavily, his bandages darkened with fresh blood. Michael sat in the kitchen, staring at the files spread before him, the ledger from the warehouse, the photographs he had taken. The anonymous note, all pointing toward a truth that was circling closer with each step. He knew the time had come to dig deeper into the archives of cases he had once left unfinished. The following morning, Michael returned to the precinct under the guise of routine work. He slipped into the records room shelves heavy with forgotten files, dust thick on their edges. He searched until he found the case from 3 years ago, the one labeled Dalton Suspected Insufficient Evidence. He opened the folder and read through statements, photographs of stolen dogs, and reports of unmarked vans moving late at night. At the bottom was a single sheet listing potential suspects. Among them stood the name Frank Dalton. Michael felt a jolt of recognition, the same Dalton he had crossed paths with years earlier, when a narcotics investigation fell apart due to lack of evidence. Dalton had walked free, then smirking in the courtroom as if untouchable. Now his name was tied to the cruelty unfolding around Willow Creek. As Michael traced the pages, he noticed a photograph clipped to the back, a younger Dalton standing beside a German shepherd, his hand gripping the leash tight, a cruel pride etched across his features. The dog's bent ear and dark eyes struck Michael like a blow. It was Ranger, younger, unscarred, but unmistakably the same dog lying in his living room now. The discovery tightened every muscle in Michael's body. Dalton had once controlled Ranger, likely as part of his illegal operations, exploiting the shepherd's training for smuggling or intimidation. When Ranger had been injured, Dalton had discarded him like broken equipment, stripping him of worth but not loyalty. Michael closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. The story had come full circle. The dog he had saved was a survivor of Dalton's cruelty, and now together they were drawn back to finish what had been left undone. Later that day, Michael shared his findings with Carla, the only ally he could trust after Jordan's betrayal. Carla's face hardened as she studied the photograph. "If this gets out," she said, "Dalton's name will finally carry the weight it deserves. But he'll come for you before you can build the case. You need to be ready." Michael nodded. "I'm past ready. This time he won't slip away." At home, Emily sensed the heaviness in her father's silence. She sat beside Ranger, sketching him again, and asked softly, "Dad, what did you find?" Michael hesitated, then crouched to her level. "Sweetheart, the man behind all of this is someone I tried to stop years ago. I failed then, but I won't fail now. And Ranger, he knew that man too. He used to be forced to work for him." Emily's eyes widened with shock and sadness. She wrapped her arms around Ranger's neck, whispering, "He's ours now. He'll never go back." The shepherd pressed his head against her shoulder, his eyes closing as if in agreement. That evening, Michael stepped outside with Ranger into the cool air, the horizon painted in streaks of red. He studied the shepherd, now marked with scars, but still standing tall, and spoke aloud, though no one else could hear. "He thought you were broken. He was wrong. You're the strongest partner I've ever had." Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked, as if understanding the vow. The next day, a new threat arrived. Taped to the Harris mailbox was a photograph of Emily walking to school, her backpack slung over her shoulders, Ranger at her side. Scrawled beneath were the words, "No dog can protect her forever." Michael's grip on the picture tightened until the edges tore. He showed it to Carla that night, and together they began mapping Dalton's network, cross-referencing old case files with the movements Michael had tracked recently. Every road led back to the same truth. Dalton had resurfaced, bold and dangerous intent on reclaiming what he considered his. Michael prepared the house with extra locks, reinforced windows, and a loaded rifle within reach. He could not rely on the department, not while Reynolds turned a blind eye. He confided only in Carla, and the two devised a plan to draw Dalton out. Ranger, though still healing, shadowed Michael constantly, his limp not diminishing the fire in his eyes. Emily, though frightened, refused to leave his side, her courage mirroring the loyalty she had seen in the shepherd. That night, Michael stood at the edge of his porch, the cold air biting his skin, the photograph of Dalton with Ranger clutched in his hand. He remembered the smirk on Dalton's face in the courtroom years ago, the arrogance of a man who believed he could twist the law to his will. But now the tables had turned. Dalton had underestimated both a battered dog and a father unwilling to lose again. As the wind rustled through the pines, Ranger pressed close to Michael's leg, steady and alert. Michael whispered, "We'll finish this together." And with that vow, he stepped back into the house, knowing the confrontation was inevitable. Dalton's shadow was no longer a ghost from the past. It was a storm gathering on the horizon, and Michael had no intention of standing down. The raid came with the weight of finality, though Michael knew victory never came so cleanly. With Carla's help and a handful of state officers who still believed in the badge, they stormed Dalton's compound on the outskirts of the quarry under the cover of dawn. Ranger, though, still favoring his injured shoulder, insisted on leading the way, his low growl guiding them through the maze of cages and tarps. The scene that unfolded was grim, but undeniable rows of frightened dogs, malnourished, chained and shivering in the chill, their eyes wide with both fear and hope. Dalton's men were caught off guard, subdued after a brief struggle, while Dalton himself attempted to flee through the woods, only to be cornered by Carla and Ranger working in silent coordination. For a brief moment, Michael locked eyes with Dalton, the same defiance from years earlier, now tainted with desperation. Michael cuffed him, feeling the long-awaited weight of justice settle across his hands. But as the dust settled and the cages swung open, a hollowness crept in. The files Michael had seen in the warehouse days before, the ledger marked with numbers, the collar stamped with insignia. None of it was found in Dalton's office. Boxes of documents had been removed, hard drives wiped clean, leaving behind only scraps too thin to hold up in court. Dalton was in custody, but without the critical evidence, conviction would be an uphill climb. Michael's stomach twisted as he realized someone within the department had likely tipped Dalton off, ensuring the trail could still vanish. Back at the station, Reynolds praised the team for the bust in front of the cameras, yet his eyes avoided Michael's and his words felt rehearsed. Reporters crowded for photographs of the rescued animals, not of the men who had betrayed their oath. Michael stood silently, Emily watching from the corner with Ranger pressed to her side, both of them recognizing that justice had not been fully served. Dalton's smirk during booking confirmed it. He knew the missing evidence might save him once again. When Michael returned home that evening, exhaustion weighed on him, but what awaited him on the porch was something unexpected. Neighbors stood gathered arms full of blankets, food, and supplies. Mrs. Rowley, who rarely smiled, handed Emily a bag of dog food and said in her sharp voice, "You'll need this more than we do." Behind her came others, the baker's wife carrying bowls, the mechanic with spare lumber for building kennels, children clutching leashes and toys for the dogs. Word had spread quickly, and though the law might falter, the town had chosen its side. Emily's eyes shone as she helped arrange the supplies in the yard. Scout barked in excitement while Ranger, tired but proud, sat like a sentinel watching the community transform their home. Michael thanked each neighbor, his voice low but sincere, and for the first time since the fight began, he felt a measure of strength not from authority, but from solidarity. The Harris home, once a quiet refuge, was becoming something larger, a place of healing for the broken animals pulled from Dalton's grip. Within a week, the backyard looked transformed. Michael and Emily built makeshift kennels with the mechanic's help, shaded by tarps strung across poles, while Carla arranged for veterinary volunteers to treat the injured. The sound of barking, once a signal of fear, now carried a note of hope. Each rescued dog found comfort in the presence of Ranger, who, despite his limp, walked among them with calm authority, assuring them with his presence that safety was possible again. Emily named the older Labrador Hope, her hand always gentle on the dog's scarred side, while Scout darted through the yard with the playfulness of youth. At night, Michael sat on the porch, rifle still within reach. But for the first time in months, The quiet carried less dread. The people of Willow Creek had chosen to believe in him and his family, and in the loyalty of a battered German shepherd who had led them all to the truth. Still, the absence of evidence haunted him. Dalton sat in a cell, but lawyers would circle, and without the missing files, justice was fragile. Michael stared at Ranger lying by his boots, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight, and whispered, "We're not finished. Not yet." Ranger lifted his head, ears tilting toward the woods, as if he too knew the fight was not done. As summer deepened, families came to the Harris home to adopt dogs, children's laughter echoing across the yard. Emily painted a wooden sign and hung it proudly on the fence Haven for Paws. The words were uneven, but they carried truth. Michael watched her paint, his heart swelling with both pride and worry. The town stood behind them, yet the shadows of Dalton's influence lingered. Evidence had vanished, allies had betrayed, and justice was still incomplete. When Michael closed the gate each evening, he knew the war was not won. Dalton's network stretched farther than Willow Creek, and the missing files meant there were still players hiding in the dark. But the Harris home now carried light, and in that light stood Emily, Scout Hope, and Ranger, each scarred in their own way, each bound by loyalty and second chances. The weeks following the raid brought both calm and weight to Michael's shoulders. Calm because the barking that once echoed in fear now carried laughter, and playweight because every time he looked at the missing evidence he knew Dalton's trial might not hold. Yet life moved forward at the Harris home. Volunteers continued to arrive with food and supplies, and Emily took to her new role as caretaker, with a seriousness far beyond her age, washing bowls, helping injured dogs, and sketching their faces as if she could hold their souls on paper. Ranger healed slowly, his limp permanent, but his spirit unshaken, patrolling the fence line each evening, his presence alone enough to quiet the dogs that trembled at every passing car. Michael spent long hours at the precinct, compiling reports, trying to piece together what had vanished. But each time he returned home and saw the yard filled with wagging tails, he felt both pride and sorrow. One evening, Emily sat beside him on the porch, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. She drew Ranger again, this time with a medal hanging from his collar, a badge etched in careful strokes. She looked up at her father and asked softly, "Dad, why does it hurt you so much when you talk about Dalton?" Michael hesitated, the question striking deeper than he expected. He set his coffee down, folded his hands, and for the first time told her the truth. "Years ago, I had a chance to stop him. We had evidence witnesses, but it slipped away. I thought I had done everything right, but when he walked out of court smiling, I realized I had failed. And because I failed, he kept hurting others. That's the weight I've carried, Emily. That's why I fight so hard now." Emily's eyes shone with unshed tears. She leaned against him and whispered, "But you didn't fail this time. You saved Ranger and Scout and Hope and all the others. You didn't let him win." Michael's throat tightened. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, feeling the truth of her words sink deeper than any metal could. Ranger rose from the steps and walked over, laying his head in Emily's lap as if confirming her judgment. For the first time in years, Michael felt the wound of regret soften, not vanish, but shift into something bearable. A month later, the town held a gathering in the park. Families who had adopted the rescued dogs brought them to play their laughter rising into the warm afternoon. Mrs. Rowley baked pies, the mechanic grilled burgers, and a local pastor spoke briefly about loyalty and redemption. When Michael and Emily arrived with Ranger walking proudly at their side, the crowd broke into applause. The mayor stepped forward and presented Ranger with a silver tag engraved "Protector of Willow Creek." He fastened it to the shepherd's collar while the crowd cheered. Ranger stood tall, ears, pricked tail, swaying gently, not a pet in that moment, but a symbol of resilience. Emily beamed, clapping the loudest, her cheeks flushed with joy. She whispered to Ranger, "You're our hero," and the shepherd pressed his nose against her cheek. Michael watched the scene unfold, pride filling him in a way that reached beyond duty. The community had chosen to honor not only Ranger, but the bond that had carried them through darkness. That evening, as the sun dipped low and families returned home, Michael and Emily lingered in the park. Emily turned to her father and said, "You always told me the badge meant protecting people, but maybe it also means giving second chances like Ranger gave us." Michael smiled, his heart stirred by the wisdom in her young voice. "You're right, sweetheart. The badge means loyalty, and sometimes loyalty is what saves us all." Back home, the haven for Paws bustled with life. Scout chased butterflies across the yard. Hope lay in the grass with her scars slowly fading into memory. And Ranger kept watch from the porch, the new silver tag gleaming in the evening light. Michael sat with Emily at the table reviewing adoption forms, their laughter mingling with the barks outside. The pain of the past had not vanished, but it had been transformed into purpose. On the final night of summer, Emily drew one last picture herself, her father and Ranger standing side by side, the words, "We're home," written beneath. She handed it to Michael, who framed it on the wall above the fireplace. He looked at Ranger lying before the hearth, eyes heavy but peaceful, and whispered, "You gave us more than safety. You gave us hope." Ranger's tail tapped the floor once, slow and steady, and in that small gesture, Michael knew the story was complete. A dog once abandoned had become a guardian, a symbol not of brokenness but of redemption. And a father once haunted by failure had found healing in loyalty, in courage, and in the unwavering love of his daughter. That was the story of a broken dog who became a protector. Which moment stayed with you the rescue? The threats or the final act of courage? Share your answer in the comments and tell us your country. We'd love to see how far this story travels. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.